My name is Lauren Hartwell. I'm 31 years old, and I own a design studio in Nashville. If you're sitting down with your coffee right now, I want you to take a look at the mug in your hand. Feel the warmth of it spreading through your fingers. It's a good, grounding feeling, isn't it? Now, try to imagine holding that exact same mug, but your entire body is completely frozen from the inside out. Your heart is hammering against your ribs. Not because you're running, but because the two people who were supposed to spend their lives protecting you have just walked into your home, looked at the man you love, and tried to set your entire life on fire. That was me on a rainy Wednesday morning in April. I was standing in my own kitchen, holding my coffee with both hands, watching a trap snap shut. My sister Caroline looked my fiancé Aaron straight in the eye. She didn't blink. She didn't hesitate. She just let the words drop into the quiet of the room like lead weights. "She only wants you for your money, Aaron." And right next to her, my mother, Patricia, smiled. It wasn't a smile of comfort or a smile of maternal warmth. It was a sharp, satisfied little smirk, the exact same smile she wore 9 years ago when she thought she had buried my future for good and left me with nothing. She tilted her head, looked at Aaron, and said, "Ask her about the man she's been hiding. If you've ever had to earn your place in your own family, if you've ever felt like you had to audition for their love, while they secretly rooted for your failure, then you know the exact kind of cold that washed over me in that moment. It's a psychological shockwave. Your mind registers the betrayal before your voice can even form a defense. But here's the thing they didn't know. I didn't defend myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry, and I didn't stomp my feet. I just stood there, breathing in the scent of the hazelnut coffee that was rapidly going cold between my palms, and I watched them. They had absolutely no idea that Aaron hadn't just been sitting around blindly loving me. They had no idea that he had been quietly, meticulously collecting the truth for 4 straight months. They had no clue that the very man they were trying to drag through the mud and use as a weapon against my character had been waiting 9 long years to finally speak his piece. My mother and sister walked into my apartment thinking they were going to end my wedding. They thought they were going to watch me crumble, pack my bags, and slip back into the small, broken version of myself that they could easily control. But what they actually did, what they completely failed to realize, was that they had just woken up the silence I had been feeding for 9 years. The quiet girl they thought they had managed to bury back in 2017 didn't live here anymore. Before I take you back to the very beginning of how a mother and a sister manage to rewrite a person's identity for a decade, I want to ask you a serious question. Have you ever had to sit completely still while the people who share your DNA try to burn down the only good thing you have left? If this story is already stirring up something inside you, if it's making you angry on my behalf, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop your city and the exact time where you are right now in the comments. I truly want to know who is listening to this, because sometimes just knowing someone else is witnessing your truth is where the healing actually starts. Now, let me take you back to where this really began. Not the kitchen. The kitchen was just the morning my family found out the silence they had been counting on had stopped paying interest. To understand why my mother and sister felt so comfortable walking into my home and trying to dismantle my life, you have to understand the difference between being useful to a family and being genuinely wanted. For 9 years, I allowed my family to believe a specific version of me. They thought I did small-time, sporadic freelance work from my couch. They thought I was always just one bad month away from financial ruin, barely scraping by in Nashville. That misunderstanding was completely intentional on my part. I had spent nearly a decade curating exactly what Patricia and Caroline were allowed to know about my life. The truth, the part I locked away behind a wall of silence, was that I am the sole owner of Hartwell Interiors. We have a gorgeous corner studio space right in the heart of the Gulch, 6 full-time employees, and a client list that premium builders would kill for. Most of our high-end momentum started back in 2023 with a single phone call from a woman whose husband played professional hockey for the Nashville Predators. She loved my work, she told her friends, and the dominoes just started falling. Last year alone, my studio billed just over $1.2 million. But I never told my mother that number. I never told Caroline about our features in design magazines, or the commercial contracts, or the steady, beautiful security I had built with my own 2 hands. Why? Because in my family, an independent, successful Lauren was an insulting Lauren. It was a version of me that didn't run through my mother's permission slip, which meant it wasn't allowed to exist. If you have a narcissistic parent or a toxic sibling, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They don't want you to thrive. They want you to survive just poorly enough that you still need them to validate your existence. They don't want a daughter who builds $1 million business. They want a daughter who stays small, fragile, and eternally grateful for whatever breadcrumbs of approval they throw under the table. To my mother, I was only acceptable when I was broken. When I was struggling, I was useful to her ego. The moment I started standing on my own 2 feet, I became a threat to the narrative she had constructed. Then, in March of last year, I met Aaron Castellan. I wasn't looking for love. I was attending a fundraiser for a local children's hospital, standing near the back of the room, when this tall, quiet man walked up to me. He didn't try to use a slick pickup line. He didn't ask me what I did for a living right away. Instead, he pointed to an antique Persian rug near the podium and asked me 3 highly specific questions about its weave and origin. We ended up talking for 2 hours about textiles, history, and architecture before he ever even asked for my name. When I asked him what he did, he downplayed it completely. He just smiled, shrugged his shoulders, and told me his work was boring strategy consulting. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that I discovered his boutique firm, which operates out of both Nashville and Atlanta, was an absolute powerhouse. In fact, his firm was the exact reason 2 of my absolute favorite corporate design clients had ever found my studio in the first place. He was brilliant, successful, and entirely humble. More than that, Aaron was the first person in my life who truly saw me. Not what I could do for him, not how I made him look, but me. When he proposed to me on the 19th of September, we were sitting on the porch of a small, rustic cabin we had rented up in Asheville. The mountain air was crisp. The twilight was settling in, and he just reached into his pocket and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. I didn't give a graceful, cinematic answer. I just cried for about 10 solid seconds, and then I burst out laughing because I was so incredibly happy, and he laughed right along with me. But do you want to know how deep the conditioning goes? We did not tell my mother about our engagement for 2 full weeks. I dreaded the phone call because I knew, instinctively, that she would find a way to taint it. And when I finally gathered the courage to call her and tell her the news, she didn't say, "Oh, Lauren, I'm so incredibly happy for you." She didn't say, "Tell me everything about how he asked." Instead, her voice dropped into that sweet, venomous purr she always uses, and she said, "He's a wonderful catch, honey." A catch. Like Aaron wasn't a human being I loved, but a prize fish I had managed to pull out of a private pond she had personally stocked for me. Right then and there, the emotional boundary lines were drawn. The wedding was set for Saturday, the 2nd of May, at St. George's Episcopal in Belle Meade. We planned a small, intimate rehearsal dinner for 38 guests at the historic Hermitage Hotel downtown. My mother and sister were on that guest list simply because, at 31 years old, I still didn't know how to write a list of major life events without including the people who gave me life. I was still trying to buy their love with invitations. I had no idea that they were already planning to use that invitation to stage my public execution. To fully grasp why the trap in my kitchen felt so cold, we have to look directly at the ghost that has been living in the back room of my chest since May of 2017. I was 22 years old, graduating from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville with a degree in interior design. I hadn't slept properly in 3 solid weeks because I was waiting for a single piece of mail. When it finally arrived on the 18th of May, it felt like my entire life had officially begun. It was on creamy, heavy paper with a discreetly embossed letterhead that read, Marlowe and Voss Design Group, Madison Avenue, New York. It was a prestigious summer internship. It offered $2,800 a month for 3 months, complete with housing in a shared apartment in Murray Hill. The offer was signed by the creative director himself, a man named Theodore Marlowe. I called him to accept, and we had this incredible, careful conversation where he asked me deep questions about my portfolio, my color theories, and why I disagreed with a specific chapter of an architectural book he loved. He laughed at my stubbornness and said, I will see you on June 12th, Ms. Hartwell. I framed that letter and hung it right over my desk. I immediately called my mother. I thought she would be proud. Instead, her voice went completely flat. She asked for the name of the firm 3 times. She demanded the exact Madison Avenue address, the office phone number, and the full name of the creative director. I read all of it to her, straight from the paper, thinking she was just taking notes to celebrate with me. I didn't realize I was handing her a blueprint for my own destruction. At the time, I was dating a wonderful, gentle boy named Bryce Whitlock, a children's book illustrator who drew tiny, confused-looking dogs. He was sweet, kind, and entirely the wrong kind of suitable for my mother's grand social ambitions. Bryce had agreed to move to New York with me, and we were going to crash with his sister in Brooklyn to start our lives. I told my mother about Bryce joining me in the very same phone call. That was my fatal mistake. My mother never yelled. She didn't throw a tantrum. Instead, she quietly printed out an article about divorce rates among creative class couples and left it sitting on our kitchen counter for 3 straight days without saying a word. Then came the morning of June 14th, exactly 2 days before my scheduled flight to LaGuardia. At 7 o'clock in the morning, my mother knocked on my bedroom door, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a crisp white envelope in the other. Her face was a mask of perfect, tragic sympathy. Baby, I am so sorry, she whispered as she set the envelope on my mattress. Inside was a letter on that exact same creamy paper. It stated that due to sudden, unforeseen internal restructuring decisions affecting the summer cohort, Marlowe and Voss regretted to inform me that my internship offer was being formally rescinded. It was dated June 12th and signed in a thin black scrawl, T. Marlowe. My throat closed up instantly. I couldn't breathe. I called their corporate office this morning just to ask about employee parking for you, my mother said, rubbing my back with a steady, rhythmic pressure that felt like comfort but was actually a victory lap. They told me the news over the phone, Lauren. I asked them to immediately put it in writing so you could have some closure. I am so sorry, honey. I sat on that bed and cried until my ribs ached, completely blind to the reality of what had just happened. I didn't call the firm back because I was too humiliated, too broken, and too deeply conditioned to believe that a written letter handed to me by my own mother was the final, absolute truth. Bryce begged me to call them just once to clarify. But I closed my laptop and gave up the Murray Hill apartment. I sent a polite email to the housing coordinator stating I wouldn't be coming. I had absolutely no idea that my mother had spent the previous afternoon hunched over the family desktop computer, meticulously typing out that rescission letter herself. I didn't know that 2 days prior, she had called Marlowe and Voss, pretending to be a panicked, weeping relative, telling their HR department that I had suffered a massive, debilitating nervous breakdown and would be entirely unable to fulfill my internship duties. And worst of all, I had no clue that just 48 hours after she handed me that fake envelope, my 24-year-old sister Caroline, unemployed, recently divorced, and deeply envious, boarded a flight to New York carrying a portfolio cover that didn't belong to her. She walked into Madison Avenue using my name, my identity, and my future, while I stayed behind in Tennessee, completely buried alive in a silence I thought I had earned through my own psychological fragility. For more than 7 years, I built a quiet, functional life inside the walls of that lie. I convinced myself that I was simply too fragile for the fast-paced design world of Manhattan. I open-sourced my own trauma to myself, rereading that ghost narrative every single time I faced a major professional hurdle. But lies, no matter how carefully structured, always leave a loose thread hanging, and all it takes is one accidental pull for the entire tapestry to unspool. My thread began to unspool in December of 2024. I was sitting in my studio office late on a Friday afternoon, watching the winter dusk settle over the Nashville skyline. A notification popped up in my inbox from a completely randomized, encrypted Proton Mail address. The subject line was just 4 words. About 2017, read when ready. There was no text in the body of the email. There was only a single PDF attachment labeled roster s17.pdf. When I clicked it open, my eyes landed on an official intern roster grid from Marlowe and Voss Design Group, dated June 2017. I scrolled down to the 3rd row, 5th column. There, printed in clean black ink, was my name, Lauren Hartwell. But when I looked at the ID badge photo right next to my name, the air left my lungs entirely. The face staring back at the corporate camera wasn't mine. It was Caroline. Her hair had been bleached a lighter blonde, and she was wearing a pair of thick, black-rimmed glasses. A detail that made my stomach turn because Caroline had possessed perfect 20/20 vision her entire life. She had literally worn costume glasses to impersonate me at a corporate check-in desk. I closed my laptop immediately. I didn't open it again for 3 full days because the sheer catastrophic weight of what that image implied was too massive for my brain to process. To accept that photograph meant accepting that my entire adult timeline was a fabricated prison. When I finally gathered the courage to reopen the file, I went to my desk drawer and pulled out the small archival box where I kept the relics of my college days. I laid the original 2017 offer letter from Marlowe and Voss flat on my desk, and right next to it, I placed the rescission letter my mother had handed me on my bed. I turned off the overhead office lights, switched on my phone's flashlight, and began to analyze them side by side like a forensic detective. Once you know a narrative is a lie, the technical flaws scream at you from the page. Under the direct, harsh beam of the flashlight, the discrepancies were devastatingly obvious. First, the embossed corporate logo on the rescission letter was exactly 4 millimeters smaller than the authentic logo on the original offer letter. My mother had tried to scan and replicate the letterhead, but the scaling factor was off. Second, when I looked at the signature block, the typed name of the creative director was missing the tiny, distinct dot above the lowercase letter I in the word Marlowe. The font didn't match. But the final, undeniable proof was in the punctuation of the dateline. The fake rescission letter read 12/06/2017, using distinct periods between the numbers. Standard American corporate letters use slashes 06/112/2017. Do you want to know why there were periods? Because my mother had spent 12 years formatting the weekly bulletin for our local church in Knoxville using that exact same period-delimited style on the family desktop computer. It was her digital fingerprint, left entirely by accident, on the document that altered my life. I sat alone in the dark office for hours, holding those two pieces of paper, watching the streetlights flicker on outside. I didn't cry. The time for crying had passed years ago. Instead, a deep, icy clarity settled into my bones. If you are listening to this right now, and you've ever had to become a literal detective in your own life just to prove to yourself that you aren't crazy, do me a huge favor. Stop what you're doing, go down to the comments section, and type the word witnessed. I want to see how many of us have had to dig through the ashes of our own family histories just to find the truth that was hidden right in plain sight. Because once you see the flaws in the lie, you can never go back to being the victim. You become the strategist. Once you uncover a forgery that stole 9 years of your life, you don't call for a screaming match. You don't send an angry text message that gives away your hand. You pack a single overnight bag. You book the earliest Delta flight out of Nashville to LaGuardia. And you go find the people who were there when the ink was fresh. I landed in New York on a freezing Thursday morning in December. I took a yellow cab through the Midtown Tunnel, down into Tribeca, and walked the final block to Greenwich Street entirely alone. I was heading to Marlowe Advisory, the boutique design consulting firm founded by Theodore Marlowe after he left Madison Avenue. When I stepped onto the 12th floor, the aesthetic was exactly what you'd expect from a master designer. Oak floors, minimalist lines, and a single yellow tulip in a glass jar on the reception desk. A gray-haired woman named Yvette looked up at me. She didn't even ask for my ID. She just stared at my face for one long, breathless second and whispered, "Miss Hartwell? He's been waiting for you. Please." Theodore Marlowe stood up from behind his desk. He was a slim, elegant man in a charcoal cardigan. He looked at my face, then he looked down at an open paper folder on his desk, and then he looked back up at me. "Do you have your offer letter with you, Miss Hartwell?" he asked, his voice low and incredibly careful. I reached into my bag, pulled out the authentic 2017 letter, and laid it flat under his desk lamp. He positioned it directly next to a document in his own file, studying the text for 8 silent seconds. When he finally looked up, he let out a long, heavy breath. "You're the real one," he said quietly, almost to himself. He poured me a glass of water and pushed a thick black binder across the desk. "I have carried 2 heavy suspicions since June of 2017, Lauren," he told me. "The first was that the young woman who arrived at our office under your name was completely incapable of the design theories we discussed on the phone. She couldn't explain her own portfolio. The second suspicion was that something terrible had happened to you. We tried your home number twice in the second week of June. We left 2 detailed voicemails offering to help. We never heard back, and the woman who came insisted she was you. We didn't have the legal basis to call her a liar until October, when we caught her blatantly plagiarizing your old undergraduate work to pass a client review. We terminated her immediately, but I always kept this file." I opened the binder. There was Caroline's intake form, her fraudulent signature, her corporate badge photo, and the official termination papers. And right there in Marlowe's notes, I saw the dates of the 2 corporate voicemails I never received. Because my mother had physically stolen my phone that week, and swapped out my SIM card to ensure I remained entirely in the dark. I flew back to Nashville that night with the black binder locked in my bag. When I got to my apartment, I asked Aaron to come over. He arrived at 6:12 p.m. while a steady rain was beating against the glass. I sat him down at the kitchen island, opened the binder, and told him the entire story from start to finish. The forged letter, the identity theft, the stolen corporate voicemails, and the creative director who had carried the truth for 9 years. I talked for exactly 14 minutes. My heart pounding, waiting for him to tell me it was too crazy to believe. But Aaron didn't blink. His face remained perfectly calm, perfectly steady. He looked at the side-by-side letters, looked at Caroline's badge, and then he quietly pulled his phone out of his pocket. He unlocked it, opened his notes app, and turned the screen around to face me. There was a folder titled Lauren, Thanksgiving. I scrolled through it. Aaron had taken 4 detailed notes during a family holiday meal at his parents' house back in November. Every single note was a sentence my mother or Caroline had let slip about my alleged breakdown in 2017. Sentences that completely contradicted the timelines they had given him just hours earlier. "How long have you been keeping this?" I whispered, my eyes filling with tears. "Since Thanksgiving," Aaron said, reaching across the counter to take my hand in his. "You were doing your work, Lauren, and I was doing mine." I knew their stories didn't align. "What do you want to do now?" I looked at the binder, and then I looked at the man who truly loved me. "I don't want a lawsuit," I said. "The legal statutes have run out anyway. I just want the silence to stop. I want them to be in a room surrounded by every single person they care about most when the truth finally speaks. I want a wedding that actually belongs to us." Aaron smiled. A slow, brilliant, dangerous smile. "If we do this," he said softly, "we do it where they will never be able to spin the narrative again." Friday night, April 24th. The Hermitage Ballroom. We let them walk completely into the trap. For 4 months, Aaron and I lived a double life. We finalized our seating charts, reviewed floral arrangements, and took screenshots of every single intrusive message my mother's uninvited wedding consultant sent to my studio kitchen. We knew that Caroline had even run into Aaron at a bar in Germantown, subtly testing the waters, continuing to paint me as the unstable sibling who had never quite recovered from her 2017 breakdown. Aaron had paid for his drink and walked out, completely aware that the trap was already set. Then came Friday night, the 24th of April, at the Hermitage Hotel Grand Ballroom. The room was stunning. The soft jazz from the piano player in the corner bounced off the gold leaf ceilings, creating an atmosphere of pristine, high society elegance. 36 guests filled the space. I wore a long, structured emerald silk dress, and Aaron looked incredibly sharp in his navy suit. At exactly 5:45 p.m., I walked out to the hotel's front entrance alone. A black sedan pulled up, and my father, Edward, stepped out. He had driven all the way in from Knoxville. I had not seen his face or heard his voice in 9 long years, a casualty of the deep family fractures my mother had engineered. He looked older, his hair completely silver, wearing the exact same camel-colored sport coat he had owned when I was in college. When his eyes met mine, his chest heaved. He wrapped his arms around me under the porte-cochere and wept silently into my shoulder. "I am so sorry I was 9 years late, Lauren," he whispered. I squeezed him tight, blinking back my own tears. "You're right on time, Dad. Let's go inside." My mother and sister arrived together at 6:08 p.m., radiating a smug, triumphant energy. They believed tonight was the night they would finally expose my secret man and break my engagement. At 6:15 p.m., right on schedule, Theodore Marlowe walked through the ballroom doors. I had intentionally introduced him to the room as a family friend of Aaron's mother from New York. When I brought Theodore over to face my mother, he extended his hand with a polite, razor-sharp smile. "Miss Hartwell," he said, holding her hand for a beat too long. "I believe we've spoken on the phone before." Summer of 2017. My mother's face drained of color for a split second, a tiny crack in her porcelain mask before she forced a tight laugh. "I'm afraid I don't recall." "That's perfectly fine," Theodore replied smoothly. "I do." We sat down for dinner at 7 p.m. The toasts began moving gracefully around the room, full of warmth and love from Aaron's family. But the moment the microphone became available, my mother stood up from table 4. She hadn't been asked to speak, but a public stage was exactly what she needed to execute her plan. "I'd like to share something about our family," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as the room turned to face her. "It's something Aaron deserves to hear before the wedding. Lauren has always been our dreamer. She's always been a little fragile, and we're just so grateful Aaron has found her." Before my mother could even sit down, Caroline stood up right beside her, raising her champagne glass with a cold, glittering smile. "As her older sister, I just want to say one thing tonight," Caroline announced, looking directly at Aaron. "Aaron, you're a good man, and good men deserve absolute honesty. She only wants you for your money. I wouldn't be saying this if I didn't love her enough to want her to be honest with you. And Aaron, dear, ask hers about the man she's been hiding in New York." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the ballroom. A held breath multiplied by 36 guests. My mother nodded right on cue, looking as though Caroline had just delivered a beautiful, tragic blessing. I didn't flinch. I didn't stand up. I just sat in my emerald dress, looked across the table at Aaron, and gave him a single, definitive nod. It was time. Aaron stood up slowly, adjusting the button of his suit jacket. The entire ballroom watched him, expecting a look of shock, rage, or confusion. Instead, his face was completely impassionless. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and laid it directly onto the white tablecloth. He slid a single glossy photograph out of the paper sleeve and held it up for the room to see. "You mean this, man?" Aaron asked, his voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. Caroline's eyes hit the photograph and locked. Every remaining ounce of color drained from her face instantly. "This is Theodore Marlowe," Aaron announced, turning a quarter turn so the rest of the tables could see the image. Mr. Marlowe was, in 2017, the creative director who personally extended a prestigious corporate internship offer to my fiancée, Lauren. That offer was rescinded in writing on June 14th of that year by a letter signed in his name. The letter was a total forgery. It was typed and printed on Lauren's mother's home computer using a church bulletin layout template. The internship was then fraudulently taken that summer by a woman who boarded a flight to Manhattan using my fiancé's identity documents. That woman was caught and terminated by the firm in October for blatant plagiarism of Lauren's work. Would the room like to guess which woman in this ballroom stole that life? The room didn't need to guess. Theodore Marlowe stood up calmly at table 8, holding his slim black archival binder. "I have the original corporate badge photograph and the signature ink files. Right here," he said, addressing the room like a board meeting. "Anyone who cares to verify the identity is welcome to look. I have carried this fraud folder for 9 years. My mother gripped Caroline's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. She stood up, her composure shattering completely as her voice broke. "That was 9 years ago! Let it go!" The ballroom went completely still for 11 seconds. I counted every single beat of the silence. Then my father stood up. He didn't shout. He just looked at my mother with total disgust. Patricia, sit down, he said coldly. You have said entirely enough for 1 decade. But the trap wasn't done snapping shut. Aaron's father, Charles, gestured to the man sitting right next to him. Brendan Voss, who stood up and smoothed his charcoal suit. I'm Brendan Voss, he said, looking directly at my trembling sister. My cousin co-founded Marlowe and Voss. I was physically present in the partner room when we made the decision to terminate the intern operating under the name Lauren Hartwell for professional plagiarism. The woman we fired is sitting right there at table 4, and she is absolutely not the woman sitting at the head of this room tonight. I will happily swear to that in any formal legal deposition this family would care to take. The psychological shift in the room was devastating. My mother tried to lean into her old, reliable narrative, her voice turning thin and girlish. This is just a misunderstanding. Lauren has always had severe mental problems. We've been seeing therapists. We were just trying to protect her. Helen Castellan, Aaron's mother, set her wine glass down with a sharp, definitive click. She stood up, turned her chair, and faced my mother with an icy, level glare. Patricia, Helen said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. We have all heard quite enough from you. Your daughter has spoken. The witnesses have spoken. I think it would be best if you collected your things and went home now. Please, do it while there is still a shred of grace left in this room. My mother stood frozen for one more second, entirely stripped of her power, looking around a room where not a single eye would meet hers. She grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and walked out of the ballroom side door alone. I checked the clock on the wall. It was exactly 8:42 p.m., the precise time she had left my kitchen the Wednesday before. Caroline tried to follow, but her legs literally refused to hold her weight. She collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, until a hotel waiter quietly stepped forward, took her by the elbow, and guided her out into the hallway. She never looked back at me once. The ballroom remained absolutely quiet for 11 seconds after the door closed. I sat there, counting every single beat of the silence, feeling the phantom weight of a 9-year-old prison finally crumbling to dust. Then, Curtis Vale at the piano looked over at Helen Castellan for a cue. Walter Castellan gave a single, slow nod, and a soft, gorgeous rendition of Claire de Lune began to drift through the space. Walter stood up, raising his champagne flute high into the gold leaf light. To Lauren, he said, his voice carrying the effortless weight of a man who spent 20 years defining justice. 36 glasses rose into the air as one. Helen came over to my chair, placing a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. She leaned down and whispered, "Sweetheart, you are home now, do you understand me?" "This is your home." I nodded, and it was only then, under the safety of her touch, that a single tear finally escaped my eye. My father came around the other side of the table. He didn't force a clumsy, sudden embrace. He just stood there quietly, waiting until I reached out my hand to pull him close. For 9 years, I had spent my holidays entirely alone in apartments I paid for with my own hard work, and I had deeply convinced myself that I preferred the isolation. But standing in that ballroom, flanked by my father and the family I was about to marry into, I understood the psychological truth for the very first time. Solitude had never actually been my preference. It had only ever been my emotional budget. Our wedding took place 8 days later, on Saturday, the 2nd of May, at St. George's Episcopal Church in Belmead. The morning was exceptionally cool and bright. I walked down the aisle in a structured ivory silk dress, but inside the bodice, sewn directly against the seam right over my beating heart, was a tiny square of black leather. I had personally cut it from the cover of the design portfolio I had handmade during my final year of college in the spring of 2017. the portfolio that my mother's malice had prevented from ever reaching New York. The work had survived the silence, and it walked down the aisle with me. My father's hand was beautifully steady as he guided me forward. When Aaron took my hand, his vows were exactly 5 sentences long. The 5th sentence is the one I will carry with me until the day I die. I will never make you choose between being yourself and being loved. There were 36 guests in the pews, and 2 seats were left entirely empty. The first was a tribute on my side for my grandmother, Constance, holding a single white iris. The second empty seat was the space my mother and sister might have occupied if they had chosen love over utility. They were not invited, and they stayed in Knoxville. The systemic fallout of the truth happened entirely on its own. Within days, Pinecrest Band Studio formally rescinded its corporate job offer to Caroline after a brutal 4-minute call with their general counsel regarding material misrepresentations on her resume. She lost her local consulting clients, put her townhouse on the market, and moved back into my mother's house. My mother was politely informed that her long-standing membership in the Knoxville Garden Club would not be renewed. Her close friends stopped returning her calls, and her church book club quietly requested that she step back from leading their weekly discussions. I never filed a lawsuit. I didn't need to. The truth has a natural, elegant gravity that collapses lies all by itself. I wrote one short blog post on the Hartwell Interiors website about what it genuinely means to design a room when no one in your own family has ever cared to design a safe space for you. It was shared over 22,000 times before I quietly closed the tab. On the first Monday after our honeymoon, I walked into my studio in the Gulch. I made a fresh cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and watched the bright May morning light spill across the floor in a long, beautiful slant. For 9 years, my family stole my voice and told a fabricated story about who I was at every dinner table I wasn't invited to sit at. They stole 9 years of my life. But as I look out at the future we are building, I know one thing with absolute, unshakable certainty. They will never, ever steal another sentence.